Hello guys, welcome once again to my tutorial on how a gas engine works. Our episode for today is about the gas engine. But before that, please don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe and hit the bell button to subscribe. The gas engine derives its power or energy from the heat generated by the combustion within its cylinder, of a mixture of gasoline in the form of spray mingled with air in proper proportion to form a combustible mixture. Question: what is the cycle of a gas engine? Answer: the series of events which are repeated in regular order and which constitutes the principle of operations. Question: define the term four-cycle. Answer: the term four-cycle means four-stroke cycle, the order stroke being understood. As applied to an engine, a four-cycle engine is one so constructed that its cycle of operation is completed in 4 strokes. That is, in 2 revolutions. Four-cycle operation. Engine working on this principle requires 4 strokes to complete the cycle. These 4 strokes are: 1. Admission stroke. 2. Compression stroke. 3. Power or impulse stroke. And 4. Exhaust stroke. From this, it must be evident that the four-cycle engine is working, that is, developing energy, only 1/4 of the time and idle 3/4 of the time. Accordingly, a heavy flywheel must be provided to keep the engine going during the 3 idle strokes. The energy produced during the power stroke is stored up in the flywheel. Moreover, part of this energy does no useful external work, but it's spent in overcoming the resistance due to admission, compression and exhaust. That is, the piston must move against the retarding force of 1. A partial vacuum during the admission. 2. Heavy pressure during compression, and 3. Light pressure during exhaust. The result is the flywheel gradually slows down during the 3 idle strokes, the rotation being anything but uniform. Anyone who has observed a single cylinder no doubt has noticed the very uneven rotation. This is one of the reasons why multi-cylinder engines are used on automobiles. In four-cycle operation, the mixture of gasoline spray and air is admitted to the cylinder intermittently, and the amount supplied at its admission is known as the charge. The charge is compressed to a suitable pressure and then ignited. The effect produced by igniting the mixture is to increase the pressure attained by the compression several times. It is commonly, though incorrectly, called an explosion, being a quick burning or rapid combustion of the mixture or charge. The considerable pressure produced at ignition is due to the intense heat and gives a driving force or impulse to the piston, which gradually decreases in intensity as the piston moves from beginning to end of the power stroke. This is due to the expansion of the gases. After the expansion of the gases, the products of combustion are exhausted from the cylinder on the return stroke. Question: what is the law of expanding gases as stated by Boyle? Answer: the pressure of a perfect gas at constant temperature varies inversely as its volume. Question: what is a perfect gas? Answer: one which expands at a uniform rate with uniform increase in temperature. Question: does the pressure during compression in a gas engine increase in accordance with Boyle's law? Answer: no. Summary: expressed briefly, the cycle of a gas engine composes the following operations. 1. Admission of fuel charge. 2. Compression. 3. Ignition. 4. Combustion. 5. Expansion. 6. Exhaust. The 4 strokes. For simplicity, in the following explanation of the events taking place during the 4-stroke to 4-cycle operation, it is assumed that the valve begin to open when the engine is on the dead center. However, in actual operation the valves do not synchronize with the dead center positions, but are timed more or less out of phase in order to secure better distribution of the charge and exhaust, resulting in smooth and more economical engine operation. Admission stroke. The first stroke of the cycle, variously called the charging stroke, suction stroke, etc., is properly called the admission stroke, because during this stroke that the fuel charge is admitted to the cylinder. The stroke begins with the crank on top dead center as shown in Figure 1. Figure 1. Admission stroke 1. Beginning of stroke. Piston is at top dead center, the exhaust valve has just closed and the admission valve is beginning to open. Both cams are at angle 45 degrees with the axis. Rotation of the crankshaft is clockwise. The stroke begins with the crank on top dead center as shown in Figure 1. Note: position of the inlet valve cam is such that the admission valve is just beginning to open, and the exhaust valve has just closed. The stroke is shown progressively in Figure 1 to 5 for each 45 degrees advance of the crank. Note relative position of cam and crank. The cam rotate 22.5 degrees for each 45 degrees advance of the crank. As the piston moves from top to bottom of cylinder, it produces a partial vacuum. The suction thus created draws in the fuel mixture from the carburetor. When the piston reaches to lower end of its travel, the quantity of mixture in the cylinder is called the charge. The amount of power developed depends upon the amount of fuel mixture admitted, that is, the greater the charge the greater the power. In operation, however, there are conditions which tend to diminish the amount of the charge. Since the charge is drawn into the cylinder by suction, the pressure will be a little less than that of the atmosphere. Moreover, the incoming mixture as it strikes the hot walls of the cylinder and the combustion chamber, absorbed heat from the latter and expands, hence, at the end of the stroke, there is a least amount of mixture in the cylinder than would have entered had the temperature remained constant. The action of the admission valve is another factor which reduces the amount of charge. As before stated, the simplicity of explanation. It was assumed that the valve began to open, or close when the piston was at the stroke ends. However, this would not give the best results in practice. Figure 2. Admission stroke 2. Crank at 45 degrees. For each 45 degrees movement of the crank, the cam rotate 22.5 degrees. Valves cannot open or close instantly. The movement of the valve in the opening and closing is pretty slow at best. Hence, during the first and latter portion of the stroke, the passage is so restricted that wire drawing takes place. That is, the restricted passage causes a fall in pressure necessary to balance the extra friction offered by the reduced passage. Figure 3. Admission stroke 3. Crank at 90 degrees. At this crank position, the admission valve is wide open, and it is necessary that it should be to allow free passage of the incoming charge, especially as the piston has accelerated to its maximum velocity. However, even for this position, the incoming charge will no enter fast enough owing to resistance offered by the passageway from carburetor to valve, thus less than a full charge will be admitted. Figure 4. Admission stroke 4. Crank at 135 degrees. The admission valve is now about half closed, beginning its closing movement when the crank reaches the position in Figure 3. With a gradual closing of the admission valve, the incoming charge encounters considerable resistance which cuts down the charge. However, at this stage the piston speed is considerably reduced so that the charge loss is less than it would be otherwise. Figure 5. Admission stroke 5. End of stroke. Admission valve has just closed, the piston being at the bottom dead center. Note position of cams. For instance, the admission valve is arranged to open just before the beginning of the admission stroke and to close after the completion of the stroke. It gives the following: admission valves opens 5 degrees before top dead center and closes at 45 degrees past bottom dead center. The reason for the very late closing of the admission valve is that with high-speed engines, the momentum of the rapidly entering mixture will cause a continuance of its flow after the piston has reached the end of its stroke and thus augment the charge. Figure 6 and 7. Timing of admission valve to open 10 degrees before dead center and to close 45 degrees after dead center position. Stroke 2. Compression stroke. During this stroke, the charge in the cylinder, previously admitted during the admission stroke, is compressed by the movement of the piston toward the top end of the cylinder. The compression stroke begins with the crank in the lower dead center as shown in Figure 8, which piston is the same as shown in Figure 5. Figure 8. Compression stroke 1. Beginning of the stroke. In this initial position, the piston is at the bottom dead center position, and both valves are closed and remain closed the entire stroke. The object of compression is to prepare the charge so that it will be in the condition which results in the most rapid combustion when ignited. Compression both heats the charge and brings it under pressure, 100 pounds per inch 2 or more. Figure 9. Compression stroke 2. Crank at 45 degrees. As the crank moves from the dead center to the 45 degrees position, the piston has moved a very short distance and as yet the charge has not been compressed much. The temperature of the charge rises as the compression progresses, which adds to the pressure. Figure 10. Compression stroke 3. Crank at 90 degrees. The piston now has accelerated to its maximum speed and the pressure due to compression is increasing. This pressure opposes the movement of the piston and the load is transmitted to the crank pin by the connecting rod. The work of compression is performed by the momentum stored in the flywheel. Figure 11. Compression stroke 4. Crank at 135 degrees. As the piston nears the end of its stroke, the pressure due to compression has become considerable, which is accompanied by a considerable rise in temperature. Note positions of cams and remember that they rotate at half the speed of the crank. Figure 12. Compression stroke 5. End of stroke. This is the end of the second stroke of the cycle. During these two strokes, the charge had been admitted and prepared for ignition by being compressed to a predetermined pressure which depends on the volume of the combustion space. In modern engines, this volume of clearance is as small as 1/6 or 1/7 the cycle volume. That is, the compression ratio is 6:1 or 7:1 respectively. Note relative positions of the cam and crank, remembering that the cams rotate 22.5 degrees for each 45 degrees of the crank. That is, the crank makes 2 revolutions while the cams make 1. As the piston moves from bottom to top of the cylinder, it compresses the charge, the pressure gradually increasing until at the end of the stroke the pressure is considerable. Moreover, when a gas is compressed, the work done in compressing is converted into heat, thus at the end of the compression the charge is heated to a considerable degree. The power required to compress the charge is furnished by the momentum of the rotating heavy flywheel. During compression, both valves, as must be evident, remain closed. The amount of compression depends on the percentage of clearance space in the combustion chamber. Some fuel will not stand a very high compression pressure and temperature. If the compression pressure be too high with these fuels, the charge will ignite prematurely by the heat of the compression, that is, before the end of the compression stroke, tending to drive the engine in the reverse direction. Stroke 3. Power stroke. Power stroke. The stroke is known under various names such as impulse, working, expansion, or driving stroke. The stroke begins with the crank at the top dead center as shown in Figure 13. An important event takes place at or just before the beginning of the power stroke, known as the ignition or lighting the charge by an electric spark. The timing of the spark should be varied to suit the running conditions. In general, ignition should occur little before the end of the compression stroke in order that the explosion will take place at practically constant volume, thus attaining the maximum pressure at the beginning of the stroke. Setting the ignition apparatus so that the spark will occur before the beginning of the power stroke is called advance the spark. Early ignition is essential in some instances to secure complete combustion before the exhaust valve opens. During the power stroke, both valves remain closed, assuming for simplicity that the valve timing is in phase with the piston movement. Now at the instant of ignition, the pressure due to compression is increased several times due to the intense heat of combustion. This gives the power impulse to the piston, pushing it downward and producing useful power. An exhaust valve synchronizing. That is, operating in phase with the piston movement would not give satisfactory results, especially at the high speed at which gas engines are run, and accordingly the valve gear must be arranged to give a proper amount of pre-released. Question: what is pre-released? Answer: the opening of the exhaust valve before the piston has completed the power stroke. The term pre-released relates 1. to the crank position at which the valve begins to open, and 2. to the duration of the event in degrees of crank travel. Question: what is the object of pre-released? Answer: to let some of the product of combustion escape from the cylinder before the completion of the power stroke, because if not released before the end of the stroke there would not be time enough for them to escape without creating considerable back pressure during the exhaust stroke. Pre-released, although it reduces the pressure on the piston during the power stroke and results in small loss, avoids the greater loss during the exhaust stroke due to excess back pressure. Figure 18 and 19 illustrates pre-release. In Figure 18, the exhaust valve does not begin to open until the end of the stroke, whereas, in Figure 19 the exhaust valve begin to open when the crank is in the position of 45 degrees from the lower dead center. This is the usual practice for automobile engines. Question: what is the dead center? Answer: that position of rotation in which the axis of the connecting rod coincides with the axis of a non-offset cylinder. There are two dead center during each revolution, which occurs when the piston at the beginning or end of the stroke. In either of this position, no matter how much force be applied to the piston and transmitted to the crank pin by the connecting rod, there would be no tendency to produce rotation, as these point rotation depends on the momentum stored in the flywheel. Question: what is terminal pressure? Answer: the pressure that would exist in the cylinder at the end of the stroke if the exhaust valve were given no pre-release, that is, if it did not begin to open till the end of the stroke as in Figure 18. Figure 20. Valve timing diagram. In this diagram, the points where the valve are 0.004 inch off their seats is given as the timing point, considered to be the beginning or end of their effective opening. The interval between the opening and closing points and the timing points represents that portion of the cam where the rate of lift is slow, which permits some variation in lash without causing noisy valve action. Therefore, it prefers to define the timing point as the instantaneous position when the valve begins to open, or closes, that is, comes into contact with its seats. In case expansion would be continuous, that is, not interrupted by drop. Question: what is drop? Answer: the sudden fall of pressure due to pre-release. Exhaust stroke 1. This is the last stroke of the 4-stroke cycle. On the continued operation, the various events explained for these strokes are repeated in the same sequence. Some means must be provided to clear the combustion chamber as much as possible of the burnt gases. This is accomplished by arranging the valve gear to keep the exhaust valve open a short while after the completion of the stroke. The usual practice is to close exhaust when the crank is rotated 5 degrees past the top dead center. Figure 21. Exhaust stroke 1. Beginning of stroke. Figure 22. Exhaust stroke 2. Crank at 45 degrees. During the exhaust stroke, the backward movement of the piston, from lower to upper dead center, expels the burnt gases from all parts of the cylinder except the clearance or combustion chamber. The exhaust valve, which started to open at the lower dead center position, is here partly open and the expanded gases are being discharged from the cylinder into the exhaust pipe. Figure 23. Exhaust stroke 3. Crank at 90 degrees. Here the exhaust valve is fully opened and the piston is moving at about its maximum speed, but not as far as for the corresponding position of the admission, or power strokes. Why? See angularity of the connecting rod. The gases are exhausted at higher than atmospheric pressure, offering back pressure to the movement of the piston. Figure 24. Exhaust stroke 4. Crank at 135 degrees. The exhaust valve is now partly closed, offering increased resistance to the free discharge of the burnt gases and tending to increase the back pressure which oppose the motion of the piston. Since the speed of the piston is decreasing, the choking effect due to the closing valve is not as great as it would be otherwise. Figure 25. Exhaust stroke 5. End of cycle. At this instance, the exhaust valve has just closed and the admission valve is beginning to open, ready to repeat the cycle. It must be understood that in the actual engine, the valve gear must be designed to introduce abnormal events to secure satisfactory distribution. As with the valve arranged to operate in phase with the piston, the operations may not be satisfactory. This allows the small percentage of gases remaining in the combustion chamber to escape by induction, that is, the gases in the exhaust manifold pipe being in rapid motion at the end of the stroke tend to continue so by virtue of their momentum, hence, a slight flow is induced from the combustion chamber resulting in a decrease of pressure therein. In other words, the momentum of the escaping gases tends to draw the remaining gases out of the combustion chamber. Question: what takes place during exhaust? Answer: a large amount of heat is lost. Figure 26 and 27. Engine with exhaust closing at end of stroke and 5 degrees late showing effect in each case. Figure 27. Illustrated the delayed closing of the exhaust valve. That ends our topic for today, guys, about the gas engine. If you want more on this tutorial, please don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and hit the bell button to subscribe. Thank you once again. This is Gilbert Usone Soriano. Bye and God bless.